Hello, and welcome to a video for Grade 12 Essential Math on comparing renting versus buying a place to live. This could be renting a house or an apartment, or it could be buying a house or a condo. And it's important to realize that depending on where you are financially and what your plans are for the future, this answer will change. We're going to look mainly at the financial comparisons between renting and buying, as this is a home finance unit. But also notice that there are some other lifestyle differences. Living in a house versus renting an apartment is quite a different lifestyle, and that's another reason to choose one or the other. Let's look at a couple reasons first off. Why would you want to rent versus why would you want to buy? It's important to realize we're not talking about apartment versus house. We're talking about renting versus buying. We're talking about renting versus owning. You can rent a house, or you could buy an identical house right beside it. Everything's the same. And why would you want to do one or the other? You could rent an apartment, or you could purchase a condo in the same building. Why would you want to purchase or rent? We're not talking about the building type, but how you pay for it. Also note, for these decisions, we're talking about financial decisions and important things you can do. We're not talking about the warm, fuzzy feelings of whether you own something or not. You need to have a reason to be able to justify your decision, not just because it makes me happy to own a thing. Now, the other one to note is that cheaper is not a good enough answer for this, because depending on your situation, it may be cheaper or it may be more expensive for renting or for buying. It's not an easy answer where it's always one or the other. As a general rule, though, if you're looking at similar properties, renting is cheaper up front because you don't have closing costs. That's the big one for renting. You don't have closing costs like a lawyer fee. You don't have closing costs like commission or land transfer tax or stuff like that. So renting is cheaper up front, and that can be a big deal because closing costs are expensive. You also don't have to pay for maintenance. Maintenance costs you don't have with renting. You will need to pay for damages that you cause, but general maintenance is the responsibility of the landlord. However, you may need to get the landlord to do that maintenance in some scenarios. Now, buying allows you to eventually pay off the mortgage. Buying also allows you to build equity in that you have something that is worth money that you own. You can also renovate it. This is a big one for a lot of people. If you want to paint it, or you want to demolish the kitchen and change it and build it in a different location, you can do that if you own the house. You can't do that if you're renting the house because the landlord will tend to get quite cranky. So as a general rule, renting is often cheaper if you're going to be there for a short period of time. If you're going to be there for 1 to 5 years, renting is probably a good option to look at. If you're going to be there for a long term, buying can be better. Again, this depends on the exact situation. One of the things that I find really useful is that there's some really interesting online tools that can help us with this. So here's one that the New York Times published about 6 years ago and still works perfectly. What you can do is you can go through and enter a whole bunch of different information here to figure out, is it better to rent or buy? I've tossed in some information. Let's say you're looking at a house. Let's say you're planning to stay there for 10 years. You can look at input some mortgage details. The defaults are pretty useful. You can see, hey, what's the taxes going to be? What's your closing costs? All different sort of stuff like that that you can look at. And then once you've looked at this, it says, if you can rent a similar home for less than $1,254 a month, then renting is better for you. If I go up and change something about this, say I'm looking at a home that's a little bit cheaper. So say I'm looking at a home that's about the average home price in Manitoba right now. And let's say I only want to stay there for 3 years. maybe 2 years. Say I'm going to university and I want to live there for 2 years. Well, then you'd have to rent the similar home for less than $1,878 a month. This is a useful comparison because you can see that there's a trade-off point where if you can rent a house for less than this, it's in your favor. If you can't, it's not in your favor. And there's some really wonderful details here which are really kind of neat based on a couple of other interesting factors. This is a useful tool. I'll drop the link for this in the description of this video because it's kind of fun. However, there is one important thought experiment to look at for renting versus buying. When you're talking about long-term ongoing costs, how is rent calculated? Well, let's say you purchase a property to rent out. Let's say that you have $950 a month for mortgage, $250 a month for property tax, $110 for insurance, and $200 for utilities. Let's say this is what you're paying as the owner of this property. How much should you charge someone to rent it out? Well, if we add together all of your monthly costs, it works out to $1,510 a month. If you're wanting to make a profit on this house because you're renting it in order to make money, you need to charge more than that. So as the owner, your costs are $1,510 a month. As a renter for this exact same house, your costs are going to be more than that. Maybe you want to charge $1,600 or $1,700 a month to rent this house. The important thing about this is that if you're only looking at ongoing costs for the same property, it's going to be more expensive per month to rent it because the owner wants to make a profit. But you don't have to pay the closing costs up front, so your upfront is much cheaper. Another thing to note is that there are often cheaper properties available for rent. You can find a bachelor pad out there quite cheaply, or you could find a one-bedroom apartment that's fairly cheap, but finding a very small house to purchase that's comparable in price might be more difficult. I hope this has given some insight into a couple of the comparisons between renting and buying, a couple of the things that are useful to talk about here. And I hope that it's convinced you that this isn't always an easy question, but it is one that's worth asking the questions about when you get to this point in your life. Have a great day.